understanding is that you're prepared to make a presentation of 45 minutes to an hour. Is that correct?
Yep, probably more like 45 minutes.
Okay. At the conclusion of your presentation, we have a number of people prepared to make some comments, and then we will open it up to a discussion. The topic that you're speaking is very relevant at this time. This morning's news announced that WorldCom will be probably the biggest bankruptcy in history, be even bigger than Enron. We all know that the world of business is going through an ethical crisis at this time. So I think this will be a very pertinent and possibly heated exchange. My role is to facilitate this discussion and have a good, honest exchange of ideas. Let me just very quickly introduce, we have two of our colleagues ready to respond to your presentation. We have Deborah Khoshaba, and we have Zander Ponzo. Zander is of the University of Vermont, which is close to you. So I'd like to hand the podium over to Dr. Gardner. And if we experience any technical problem, I've been told that it takes 2 or 3 minutes to reconnect the line. So we'll have someone sing a song or do something here. Okay? So, Dr. Gardner.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you. It's just afternoon here in Boston. A muggy day, not much sun. Hope that the weather is more pleasant in Vancouver. From what I understand of your meeting, you have a very broad set of interests. The title includes the words freedom, justice, and responsibility. I think I will have the most to say about responsibility, but perhaps in the process we'll touch on issues of freedom and justice as well. If you could wave, if you could hear me, that would put me at ease. Very good. Thank you. I'm going to speak today about a new project in which I've been involved since the middle 90s. It's called the Good Work Project, and as was said in the introduction, we believe that it's very relevant to events happening in the world today, including the meltdown of several hitherto large and respected corporations in the United States, and as you know, the concomitant dropping of the markets all around the world. But let me start with a word about my own background and a word of how I got into the Good Work enterprise. I'm by training a psychologist. I've worked in cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, and neuropsychology. Like many psychologists, I'm interested in figuring out how the mind works. I've taken on quite ambitious issues, the nature of intelligence, of creativity, of leadership, but I've always taken on those topics in a deliberate, amoral way. Now, I didn't say immoral. I hope I have not been immoral, but I've been amoral in the sense that I've tried to understand what intelligence is without smuggling in whether the intelligence is used benignly or malevolently. I often say that both Goethe, the German poet, and Goebbels, the German propagandist, were very gifted in the use of the German language. Goethe used it to write great works of art. Goebbels used it to foment hatred. The intelligence was potent in each case. The uses couldn't have been more different. Similarly, when it comes to things like leadership, both Nelson Mandela and Slobodan Milosevic are gifted leaders. They can get people in their countries to do things which might not have seemed possible. But I don't think many of us would defend Milosevic as being as ethical or responsible a leader as Nelson Mandela. Anyway, in 1994, I went out to California to a research center called the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. And I was there with two friends who were about to become colleagues. Your names may be known to those of you who are psychologists. How many of you are actually psychologists? That would be helpful. Okay, certainly a smattering. My two colleagues were William Damon, who is a social psychologist, and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, known to many of you as the person who writes about flow, has written a book called The Evolving Self, which is certainly a book about personal meaning. I think his work will be familiar to some of you. Anyway, we were together at this research center in California, and we were there to talk about various kinds of extraordinariness. Creativity, people who were highly creative, leaders, people who are outstanding leaders, people who have different kinds of intelligence. And there was no imperative for us to create a project together, but our hope would be that a project would emerge from this collaboration. Anyway, those of you who remember United States history will know that in 1994 there was a congressional election, and for the first time in 40 years, the Republicans won the House of Representatives. They had a leader who immediately became very well known. His face was in all the news magazines, Newt Gingrich. He's not so known anymore, but he was very well known in 1994 because he led a takeover by the so-called Gingrich cohort of representatives who were very different than both the Republicans and the Democrats who had been in office previously. What caught our attention was that Gingrich and his supporters declared that government was the enemy, one should try to get rid of government, and that all spheres of life are better controlled, better governed by the market, by market forces. Now, you will probably think I'm about to launch into a political statement, but that's not actually the case. As it turns out, the three of us, Csikszentmihalyi, Damon, and Gardner, are all over the map politically. We don't have the same political points of view. None of us has any intrinsic objection to the market. But we all felt that there are certain spheres of life which cannot and should not be governed completely by market forces. For example, should only people who can afford it, be allowed to have an education? Should only people who can afford it be allowed to have medical care? Speaking to people in Canada, there's certainly a very different philosophy about medical care in Canada than there is in the United States. Should only people who afford it be able to have legal protection? Anyway, we felt that it was too facile maintain that market forces are the best way to govern everything. They may be the best way to govern an economy or to run a business. We're not economists. We don't have strong views about that. Anyway, triggered by this Gingrich statement and this claim, which we found peculiar, we decided to embark on a project, a study of professions, to see whether people could be highly qualified experts, but at the same time show a concern about their place in the community, concern such that they could make sure that everybody who wanted it could have an education, could have medical treatment, could have legal defense, and so on. At the time, for various reasons, we called our project the Humane Creativity Project. We wanted to know whether people could be creative, use their minds freely, generatively, productively, out-of-the-box thinking, and at the same time be humane, use it in a way that displayed regard for the rest of humanity. Our hope was that a foundation, in fact, we hoped the MacArthur Foundation, would give us several $1 million so that we could study different professions in the United States, perhaps elsewhere, and to see whether people could be creative and humane at the same time. Well, life is rarely so simple as one's dreams. The MacArthur Foundation had no interest in supporting our work. Nobody liked our phrase, humane creativity. Nobody knew what it meant. So we were discouraged, but often out of a defeat, out of a challenge, out of a frustration, something healthier can emerge. After a while, we changed the name of our project from the Humane Creativity Project to the Good Work Project. That term has a religious resonance, and most people have at least some sense of what good work is. And rather than getting one large grant and doing the whole study, so to speak, in one fell swoop, we ended up making a virtue of necessity and carrying out many smaller projects, which are still very much ongoing. Indeed, the Good Work Project is now 7 years old, 1995 to 2002, but I still think it's in its early childhood, and I expect we'll be studying good work for many more years. So let me tell you about my plan for the rest of the hour, 45 minutes. I'm going to tell you how we define good work, introduce some terminology, framework for thinking about good work, describe one project that was completely carried out and described in a book called Good Work, When Excellence and Ethics Meet, and if the communications worked out, that book should actually be available at the conference. Does anybody know whether it's available? You could wave your hand. Okay, somebody thinks it's available. Great. Well, I hope some of you will take a look at it. But because that's been written about, I'm also going to tell you about many facets of the project which haven't been written about yet, facets which are still ongoing. And I'll conclude with some discussion of how I think good work can be fostered. I hope that intersects with issues of responsibility, with issues of personal meaning, and leave you with some closing thoughts from some very wise people. So that's the plan for the rest of the talk, now that I've given a bit of an introduction about myself, a bit of an introduction about the origins of the Good Work Project. In English, the word good is a pun. Good has two meanings. It means of high quality. It also means ethical, responsible. Good work is work that meets two criteria. It's highly expert, up to the highest standards, but at the same time it also is moral, ethical, responsible, takes account of its social implications. Now, it's certainly possible to be good in one of those senses and not the other. Let's take the practice of law. There could be somebody who's a very skilled lawyer, wins most of his or her cases, but only takes the cases of people who are very wealthy and cuts every corner in order to win. That person would be good in the first sense, but not the second. You could have another lawyer who takes on only indigent cases, works very hard. Your heart goes out to this lawyer for his or her efforts, but unfortunately the lawyer never wins any cases. That lawyer would be good in the second sense, but not the first sense. We look for people who embody both senses of goodness. Now, any particular example will be controversial, but let me mention some people who my colleagues and I consider to be good workers. One is the recently deceased head of the Washington Post, Katharine Graham, who agreed to publish the Pentagon Papers. Another is Jonas Salk, the physician who found the polio vaccine. Another is Jackie Robinson, the baseball player who integrated baseball about 50 years ago. There's Rachel Carson, the writer who raised consciousness about ecology in the 60s. Finally, I'm going to mention someone probably not known to most of you, but a man who had a great influence on the three authors, the three investigators, and to whom we dedicated our book. It's a man named John Gardner, no relation of mine, who was a very important civil and civic leader in the United States over the last 40 or 50 years. So there are examples of good workers, though of course you and I could debate whether Jonas Salk or Katharine Graham were or were not good workers. No person is above controversy in that respect. So, how do we think about good work? We think about good work as what happens when an individual working in a profession is able both to be highly skilled in that profession, but to have a perennial concern with the implications of what he or she does. Nobody always does the right thing. Nobody always knows the implications of his or her work, but there's a big difference between people who think about this all the time and, so to speak, try to do the right thing, and people who are quite indifferent to that whole set of concerns. In analyzing good work, we use three terms which I'm going to introduce to you: domain, field, and alignment. The domain refers to the values of a profession. Medicine is the best example here. The domain of medicine embodies values which go back to the Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm, come to the aid of somebody who's not well, don't enter into special deals or relationships with your patients. That's part of the domain of medicine. But there's also a field of medicine. The field of medicine is the current institutions and roles which are responsible for delivering health care. So in the United States, part of the field of medicine are health maintenance organizations, managed care organizations, doctors who are working for those particular entities. And you can see that while the domain of medicine, values of medicine, have not changed very much over the millennia or over the decades and centuries, the field has changed enormously. When I was young, 50 years ago, the doctor was a man, almost always a man, who came to the house with a little black bag, took your temperature, felt your pulse, listened to your heart, told you to take 2 aspirins, and you'd be okay in the morning. was very personalized, not at all high tech. Now, of course, at least in the United States, no doctor ever comes to anybody's home. The gender split is much more equal. Most of us belong to very large organizations where there are rules about how often we can see the doctor, how much we have to pay, what medicines can be prescribed, what treatments can be prescribed, and so on. The field has changed enormously. A profession is in alignment when all the different stakeholders want the same thing from the profession. A profession is misaligned when the various stakeholders want things that are very different from one another. So if the practitioners, the general public, the values of the domain, the current institutions, and to the extent that these are publicly traded entities, the stockholders all want the same thing from an entity or from a profession, it's very well aligned. Conversely, if the doctors say they want to do one thing, namely give everybody the treatment that he or she merits, but the HMO says, no, you can't see this person because they didn't pay their premium, or you can't tell them about this cure because we won't pay for it, or you can only see a person for 7 minutes because that's the capitation rate, then the field is pulling you in a very different direction from the domain. If, moreover, it's a publicly traded company, as many HMOs are in the United States today, what the shareholders want is not happy doctors, not good medical care, but the most money. They want to have high return on their investment. So they have yet a third particular desire coming out of medicine. That would be a very misaligned profession. And we argue that good work is more difficult to do when a profession is very poorly aligned than when everybody wants essentially the same thing from the profession. The domain, the field, the shareholders, the stockholders, the general public all want to have the same thing from a profession. So that's the terminology we use: domain, field, stakeholder, shareholder, and we look to see the extent to which a profession is aligned or not aligned. All alignments are temporary. No alignment is permanent. No misalignment is permanent. If it was, the profession would stop existing and something new would come to pass. It's easier to carry out good work when you are in an aligned profession, but interestingly, some of us are actually stimulated, excited, catalyzed when the domain is not well aligned. So that's an interesting interaction of personality with profession. Well, by now you probably are very hungry for an example, so I'm going to provide an example. But let me first tell you that it took us about 6 years to figure out exactly what is the question that we're asking. And those of you who are researchers won't be so surprised, because often figuring out the question is more difficult than figuring out the answer. But here's the question that the Good Work Project is designed to answer. How does a person who wants to do good work that is at once excellent in quality, but also responsible, ethical, succeed or fail in carrying out good work at a time when things are changing very quickly? Market forces are very, very powerful, and there are few, if any, counterforces. And our whole sense of time and space is being radically altered by technology. That's manifest by what's happening right now. 10 years ago, it would have been science fiction to think that I could be giving a live talk on video to folks thousands of miles away. We could then have an interchange. So what does it mean to do good work when everything is changing, time and space are completely altered, market forces have enormous power, and there are very few counterforces of any kind? That's the question that the Good Work Project is trying to answer. In the middle 90s, my colleagues and I said we would like to study a dozen different professions to understand good work in those professions. We wanted to study the military, medicine, education, law, the arts, a whole range of professions. But we had to start somewhere. So for a variety of reasons, we decided to start with those professions which have the most power over our minds and over our bodies. Now we could argue a bit about what those professions are. We decided to choose the professions of journalism and genetics. We chose journalism because journalists, writers, anchor people, whether they're in internet or broadcast or print, tell us what's going on in the world. We began today by talking about WorldCom. We wouldn't know that if journalists hadn't written about it or broadcast it. So, to use the current jargon, journalists give us the memes. They give us the units of meaning, personal meaning and public meaning, which we carry around in our head. Everybody knows what genes are. Geneticists not only study our genes, but increasingly they tell us about our life expectations, and soon they will be advising us on what to do given the roll of the dice that we had from our genes, from our biological parents, as well as various kind of interventions like genetic therapy. So just as journalists have a lot to say about what's in our minds, geneticists have a lot to say about our bodies and our fates. So we decided to call our study Memes and Genes. No editor could stand that name. Then we decided to study theater. So in-house we call our study Memes, Genes, and Scenes. But again, nobody in the editorial world likes that combination very much. But it is an easy way to remember two domains we're looking at, journalism and genetics. How do we go about doing our study? We are social scientists, so we have journalists and geneticists nominated as people who are leaders in the field, and we ask permission to interview them. And we interview them for about 2 hours. It's a very in-depth kind of interview, a lot of probing. And we ask them about a whole range of things. We ask them about their goals. What are they trying to accomplish? What gets in the way of that? What are the opportunities and the obstacles which they confront in their own work? What were the big influences in their own training? Who are their mentors? Who are their anti-mentors or tormentors, as we call them, because often those people have a big influence as well. To whom do they feel responsible? To what do they feel responsible? What kind of ethical dilemmas arise in their work? These are very searching interviews, and many people who we've interviewed between 700 and 800 people by now, say the interviews are very helpful to them, getting some distance from themselves, what you might say, getting some personal meaning from interchange. Even though the interview takes 2 hours, each interview actually takes about 2 weeks. Why does it take 2 weeks? First of all, we research these people beforehand. We do due diligence on them, so we're quite well informed about them before we speak to them. Then we get this all transcribed. The transcripts run from 30 to 50 single-space pages. Then we code them. We have a very elaborate coding system because we are social scientists, and it's the codification which takes the most time. We put the transcripts online on a software system called Nudist, which is a qualitative software system. And it means that we have instant access to all kinds of information about our subjects. So if, just to be cute about it, you wanted to know how many second-born left-handed journalists had an anti-mentor, we could tell you, because all that information is available online. So if nothing else, this project consists of an incredible archive of what busy professionals, presently from the United States, with one exception, how busy professionals think about their work life at the beginning of the 21st century. We hope that in the future people will make good use of the information that we've gathered. Let me move now to the results of the study of journalism and genetics. The study was completed in 1999, and that's important because if the study were carried out today, I think it would already have somewhat different results. Basically, we found that two fields could not be more different from one another, two professions. Genetics in 1997, 98, 99 was a beautifully aligned profession. Journalism, on the other hand, was a very massively misaligned profession. What does that mean, practically speaking? It meant that geneticists loved what they were doing. They couldn't wait to get up in the morning. No geneticists we spoke to talked about leaving the area of genetics. They loved what they're doing. Why is that? Well, according to our analysis, because at the time, everybody wanted the same thing from genetics. Everybody wanted to live longer, be healthier, and make sure we know as much as we can about how the body works. So this is a profession which at the time had very little tension in it. And while this alignment didn't guarantee people could do good work, it made it much easier because nobody was giving the geneticists any signals other than go for it. In fact, when we asked geneticists what obstacles were there in their work, often they would say the only obstacle is myself. Sometimes I don't work as hard as I should, or I get diverted, but there are no other obstacles. Quite an amazing experience from those of us who are not geneticists. Conversely, journalists were not at all happy with the state of their trade. Very few of them felt aligned. Most of them felt that they had ideals they wanted to achieve, fair, be objective, to research stories in depth, but that events had conspired to make it very, very difficult to be a good journalist. And those of you who know something about journalism will, I think, immediately understand why this is the case. It's in the United States, there are very few outlets that are owned anymore by journalists. They're almost all owned by large conglomerates, many of them by people from Canada, with names like Thompson and Black and Murdoch from Australia, who are not journalists themselves. They are entrepreneurs. They throw together different kinds of companies, and they're interested basically in one thing, the bottom line. We have a line about television in America, if it bleeds, it leads. If you ever watch local news television in the United States, it's always about a murder or a rape or some other kind of violent act. Not that that shouldn't be reported, but it's hardly the most important story in view of eternity. But because people find that this sells, this keeps people glued to the tube or buying newspapers, this becomes the operant principle in journalism. There's a very nice quotation from Harold Evans. Harold Evans was the editor both of the London Times under Murdoch, then of the Daily News in New York under Mort Zuckerman. And Harold Evans says, the problem for American newspapers is not to stay in business. Their profits are higher than ever. Their problem is to stay in journalism. And this is the frustration of the journalists because they feel they want to do good work, but they feel very much thwarted. And in the book Good Work, we talk about the various things which make it difficult for journalists to carry out good work. For example, many journalists would like to carry out investigative reporting, but increasingly they're told you can't carry out investigative reporting. Why? Number one, it's expensive. Number two, it may not yield anything. Number three, it might yield something which is critical of our chief advertiser. And as the line between the business office, the marketing office, and the advertising office, and the reporting and editorial offices gets blurred, it becomes more and more difficult to carry out good journalism. Interestingly, 50 years ago, people said the problem with American journalism is it's parochial, and newspapers are owned by families in cities, and it'd be much better if they were publicly traded companies. That analysis could not have been more wrong. Essentially, the only good newspapers in the United States anymore are ones that are owned by families. New York Times by the Sulzberger family, the Washington Post by the Graham family, and so on. This means these families have a large, if not majority, interest in the newspaper. And it means that they have influence about what's in it. If they feel the newspaper should be doing investigative reporting, they will support it, even if it means they lose money. But once it's a publicly traded company, think of it yourself. Let's say you have the misfortune of owning Time Warner AOL stock. Many Americans do, whether they know it or not, because many pension funds are in Time AOL. Nobody who reads an editorial in Time magazine feels good about the editorial because they're a stockholder. They feel good about the company if the company makes money. By the way, it's worth a fifth of what it was 2 years ago, so people who own Time Warner AOL are not feeling very good about it, but that's the cost of being in a market system. Now you might say, well, those are market influences in journalism, and I'm glad I'm not a journalist. But one of the things which we discovered is that market influences are rampant throughout the United States. There isn't a single profession, from religion, to philanthropy, education, to art, which isn't influenced, if not completely roiled, by by financial and monetary and market considerations. Take education. We now in the United States have not only charter schools, but voucher schools, where people are given vouchers. And as of the Supreme Court decision a few weeks ago, people can use the voucher in any kind of school. A voucher is simply a market mechanism where people are given a certain amount of money and asked to choose the schools they want to choose. Now, you might like that or dislike it, but it's clearly a market kind of system. At the university level now, we have for-profit companies. The largest one in the world is the University of Phoenix. It has the largest university in the world. It's in 48 out of 50 states. There are other for-profit companies like DeVry that, again, sell education to people and stockholders. And I'm at Harvard University, which at least until recently was the wealthiest university in the world. And I always ask, is it harvard.edu or is it harvard.com? Because so many things that we do at Harvard, I'm sure it's true of schools you're involved with as well, are very much oriented toward market needs, trying to attract the most attractive students, trying to give them the most attractive facilities, bidding for professors, cutting down professors' teaching loads if you want to attract prominent professors. And these are all very market-dictated kinds of things. You might think that the one profession which would be immune from market forces is philanthropy, because after all, in philanthropy, you have the money, all you have to do is give it away. But that's not true at all. We've been studying philanthropy. Indeed, philanthropy is completely influenced now by market models. The biggest question in philanthropy is, are your grantees accountable? Can you prove that what they're doing has value added? Now, there's nothing wrong with that attitude, but it's a completely market way of doing things. It's completely different from a charity attitude, or from a trust attitude, or from a, we will pick good people and just expect them to do good work. It's very much a bottom line kind of mentality. So we find that market forces are ubiquitous, and you might say, well, there have always been market forces, and it's true in a capitalist society, and most of us come from capitalist societies. These are run by market mechanisms. But in addition to the familial counterforces, which I just mentioned with reference to ownership of newspapers, they've usually been very strong religious or communal or ideological counterforces. The 20th century was a century of isms. Like them or not, isms like capitalism, socialism, fascism were counterforces to a purely market approach. Strong families, strong religious values, strong community values all serve as counterforces to market forces. But as those wane in power, as they do all over the world, especially so in a time of globalization, then the market flexes its muscles more than ever. I made a comment 2 years ago, which was incredibly prescient. Now, I don't always make prescient comments. My one regret is I didn't publish this because it was, at the time, seemed very fanciful. I said, when the markets control everything, there's only one profession left, and that's accounting. Because accounting tells you whether the information about the market is accurate or not. And if the accountants can be influenced, can be bought, so to speak, if they cook the books, to use current vernacular, then essentially there's no profession left. The reason this was a prescient comment is because 2 years ago, there was no particular reason to think that accountants were as deeply flawed as we have learned in the time of Enron and Global Crossing and World.com and so on, because these companies were audited by Arthur Andersen and Price Waterhouse and Pete Marwick and so on, the biggest accounting companies. And it now comes clear that these accounting companies were anything but objective. They didn't do due diligence. If anything, they helped to cook the books, helped to fix the figures, were in bed with the CEOs and other managers of these companies. So you can see the risk in a market-drenched world when even the information about the markets is no longer accurate. And the reason the stock market in the United States and the Nikkei in Tokyo, the Hang Seng in Hong Kong are so low, just a percentage of where they were 2 years ago, is not primarily because of 9/11, not primarily because of the attack on the Twin Towers. It's not even primarily because a company named Enron went bankrupt. It's because people like you and me no longer believe we should invest in stocks because we no longer believe there's honest information about the value of those companies. In a market world, that's a very, very serious problem. Now, I said earlier that if we did the study of journalism and genetics in the year 2002, we might find a somewhat different picture of alignment. And I can give you a few bits of evidence about that. Since 9/11, journalism has become much more important. Tabloids have less appeal. People want to know what's going on militarily, in defense, with different racial and ethnic groups, with anthrax, with other kinds of bioterror, and quite suddenly, the news is more serious. Newspapers are devoting more attention to this. Monica Lewinsky, Gary Condit, the congressman, are no longer headlines as they were before 9/11. So journalism is somewhat better aligned. No miracles, but it's a somewhat more embattled, somewhat more looked toward profession. Nothing bad has happened to genetics, but there are danger signs. One, there's much less money available for scientific research for all kinds of reasons. Number two, there have been some fatalities due to misapplied genetic therapy. This is very worrisome. Three, and I think most troublesome, it's now become clear that most research in genetics is no longer government funded, but funded by private companies, for-profit companies, which have a vested interest in certain kinds of results and not others, which often ask the researchers to keep their research secretly. And it's often hard to get peer review genetics research because everybody is being paid by one biotech company or another. So I see the handwriting on the wall for alignment within the area of genetics, and my own prediction is that we're going to see much more misalignment and non-alignment in genetics in the coming years. I said earlier that our study has expanded in various ways. And I want to mention briefly what they are because some of you may have some questions about what else we've looked at. We finished looking at the domains of journalism and genetics. We also finished studying theater. The law. We've carried out a study of business, which is quite interesting because the question arises, is business a profession? And I'd be happy to discuss that or not. So one thing we've done at one dimension of our work is to look at different professions. We would like to look at up to a dozen different professions. We can find the funding to do that. A second dimension is age. We have worked with youngsters as young as 10 years of age, kids gifted and talented in different domains, to see their own attitudes toward good work. And we, in fact, have drafted a book called Workers in Progress about the development of very young workers. One of the things that was amazing is how at a very young age, it's 10 or 12, kids are already very concerned about two things. One, whether there'll be any balance in their lives or too stressed. And number two, whether they'll make enough money. I think after the events of the last 2 years, that latter will be even a greater concern. We are investigating people of all ages up to what we call trustees. Trustees are wise people, people like John Gardner, who dedicated our book, people who worry about the fate of the whole domain, or even the whole society. In the introduction, Edward R. Murrow was mentioned. I don't know how many people here remember Edward R. Murrow, but he was a very distinguished American journalist, and he was called a trustee because he cared about the overall status of journalism. He was very devoted toward protecting that craft. So another dimension of our work is looking at good work at different ages, from children all the way to trustees. The third dimension, which we're just beginning, is to look at good work internationally. We are under no illusion whatsoever that the United States has all the answers to good work. We are working in the United States because of convenience. That's where we are. But we have a colleague in Scandinavia who's been working both in Scandinavian countries and in Latvia, former communist state, and trying to investigate notions of good work in those very different kinds of polities. And we hope someday, if we can find other people, collaborators from other countries who are interested in these issues, to be able to look at good work at different parts of the globe. We also have a few other studies which we've done on the margins, so to speak. One of the most studies is what's called a lineage study. In a lineage study, we find a very senior person, say someone like Edward R. Murrow. And then we look at his or her students and grand students and great-grand students to see the extent to which beliefs and values of these heads of the lineages are transmitted from one generation to another. Because we believe, and we hope to be able to demonstrate, that good work or bad work is basically conveyed from one person to another. You're likely to be a good worker if you're surrounded by good workers. You're likely to be a bad worker or a no good worker if you're surrounded by other people who are bad workers or no good workers. Edward R. Murrow was born at the turn of the century, and he was a mentor for people like Walter Cronkite, who many of you will know because he was a leading newscaster for CBS in America for many years. The Edward R. Murrow generation is dying out, as is his first generation of students. But it's interesting, there's one person in one institution which still is in the Edward R. Murrow lineage. It's not CBS News, long since dropped out. It's National Public Radio, which I hope is known to many of you. And the senior analyst, Daniel Shore, name who I'm sure is known to some of you, was one of the last people who was in Edward R. Murrow's lineage. And from my point of view, Daniel Shore is an example of a good worker in journalism, carries out the Murrow tradition, and many of the younger people at National Public Radio work with Shore, what I consider to be good workers now. I guess I mentioned, how many of you actually know about Daniel Shore and National Public Radio? Okay. Well, if you have a chance, you should listen to it, form your own opinion. So what I'm trying to say here is that while the Good Work Project was initially an attempt to look at simply a set of professions, now we're looking at a number of related issues having to do with age, lineage, different countries, so on. Let me move now toward the conclusion of my talk. First of all, let me give you an example of what do you do when you are a aspiring good worker, but it's difficult to do good work. And to make it concrete, let's say that you are an investigative journalist, believe the important thing about journalism is to find out what really happened, to make it public, and to soothe the afflicted, and to challenge powerful. But your boss says, we're not going to do investigative reporting anymore. It's too expensive, doesn't yield much, and as I said, it might threaten our chief advertisers. What can you do? Well, you can quit, go and sell insurance. But you probably don't want to quit. And if you have kids and a mortgage to pay and want to send them to higher education, at least in the United States, you probably can't afford to quit. So that's one reaction, is just to put up with your boss. Another one is to be a guerrilla worker. That means you say, yes, I'm going to quit, but actually you keep on doing investigative reporting, and sometimes you'll get fired, but sometimes your boss will get fired first, in which case you're the winner, and sometimes you get an accolade like a Pulitzer Prize, and that serves as a protective device. If your investigative reporting gets very much rewarded, then you build a certain kind of protective shield around you. That certainly would count as good work, but it's risky kind of good work. What we're most interested in our study, are people who actually try to change institutions or create new institutions which allow them to do good work. In the United States now, National Public Radio is taken for granted, as is C-SPAN, CNN, but these were all inventions of the last 25 years by people who felt unsatisfied with what the big networks were doing, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And so, individually or as a group, corporately, they created new entities which allowed them to do good work. You will know that in the United States now, we have many charter schools. Charter schools are controversial, not as controversial as voucher schools. But charter schools are efforts by people to say, we don't like the way the schools are now, we're going to create our own school in our own image. That those people are often aspiring good workers. So the options when you are an aspiring good worker are to quit, which is sad, but some people do. About a third of young journalists leave journalism. Almost no young geneticists leave genetics. Simply do what you're told, which is what most of us would do because it's too hard to do anything else. Say yes, but do what you believe is right and hope you'll ask for forgiveness rather than permission. Or the most praiseworthy or the most courageous, I guess, is to try to organize your own entity, which allows you to do good work. Many of you will know what Margaret Mead said about that. I'll mention that at the end of the talk. What do we find are the leverages which encourage good work? Interestingly enough, strong religious values often promote good work. And this is independent of whether people consider themselves to be religious. We interviewed many people who had a religious background who who no longer are churchgoers or even believers in God, but for whom that strong value system was very, very important. And I think for meeting on personal meaning, the origin of early values, which don't have to be religious, but in the United States almost always are, is an interesting contributor to good work. Another factor is what we call vertical support. Vertical support means working with supervisors, mentors, masters, leaders, bosses who are themselves good workers. And conversely, trying to create good work in your own professional offspring. Horizontal support is support from peers. If you're in a place with peers who try to do good work, that's going to be a positive factor. On the other hand, if you're the only person trying to do good work in a place where most people are indifferent workers or bad workers, that's going to be a real deterrent. But even if you've got good values and you're in an organization that has a tradition of good work, like I would argue the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and you have horizontal support, other people like you, same level, are trying to do good work, it still may be very difficult if you don't get occasional booster shots or inoculations. And experiences which remind people what it's like to do good work, and which help them to do it, can be tremendously important. My colleague Bill Damon, who was in charge of our journalism study, has joined forces with two good workers in journalism, Bill Kovich and Tom Rosenstiel, to create a traveling curriculum which goes to newsrooms all over America, which discusses issues of good work, and which gives specific strategies of how to do good work at a time when the pressures are enormously powerful. We have no illusion that we will solve individually the problems of good work in journalism, but these kinds of inoculation, booster shot experiences can, we believe, be very important for individuals in midlife, in mid-career. In closing, I want to do two things. One, talk with you about 4 M's, which are the 4 M's that people can do if they want to do good work. And then 5 M's of people who I think have given me insight into what good work is. First, 4 M's. The first M is mission. If you want to do good work, whether you are a professor, teacher, journalist, doctor, business person, actor, you have to say, what is my mission? What am I trying to accomplish in my work? And that can't be just something written in the mission statement. It's got to be something you believe in your heart. Why did you choose this particular calling? The next M is models. Whom do you admire? Why? Who do you look up to and say, I would like to be a worker like that? Who do you think about and say, what would Edward R. Murrow or Daniel Shore or Albert Schweitzer, Jonas Salk, Rachel Carson do in a situation like this? And who are the anti-mentors? Who are the people you'd never look up to? I don't want to be like Rudolph, I was going to say Rupert Murdoch, not one of my heroes, but you choose your own anti-mentor. So missions, models, and then 2 mirror tests. Personal mirror test is when I look at myself in the mirror as a worker, am I proud of what I see or am I embarrassed? And if I'm embarrassed by myself as a worker, what can I do so I can look at myself clearly, transparently, and not feel badly about the kind of work I do? The fourth M is the professional mirror test. If I look at my occupation as a whole, all teachers, all professors, all priests, all clergymen, all business people, am I proud or embarrassed about how my profession is behaving? Because even if you're doing good work, the rest of your profession isn't. Perhaps you have an obligation to work on your profession as a trustee. So those are the 4 M's which we see as the root to good work. Mission, models, personal mirror, professional mirror test. Then the 5 M's. The First M is from Margaret Mead, mentioned her earlier. Margaret Mead said, never condemn a small group of people who get together to do something new. Nothing important in the world has ever happened any other way. What Margaret Mead says is, if you want to do it right in your profession, don't wait for other people to do it. Get together with a small group of fellow believers. Go do it. Jean Monnet, the great French economist who had the idea for the European Union and the common market, said, I regard every defeat as an opportunity. People who try to do good work are going to be defeated a lot. It's hard. But rather than giving up or kicking the dog, they're challenged and emboldened, energized by this non-alignment or this defeat. They work even harder to try to make things come out right. The best workers who we studied are people who say, we won't know till 50 years after I'm dead whether what I'm pushing for is going to work out. And that's exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. Third M is Molière, the French playwright, Jean-Baptiste Molière. Molière said, you're responsible not only for what you do, but for what you don't do. And that's where the professional mirror test is important. Especially as you get older and more influential, you ought to try to help your profession, not just keep your own house in order. The last two M's are kind of cheating, but they're sort of funny cheating. One is E.M. Foster, whose nickname was Morgan, great British novelist. In his most famous utterance, Foster said, only connect. Only connect. What we're trying to do in the Good Work project is to connect the moral sense of goodness with the expertise sense of goodness, because we think that's what is needed in the world nowadays. And if there had been more good workers in the accounting firms, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in, talked about earlier. The final M is from a person local to me, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the sage of Concord, as he was called. Emerson memorably said, character is more important than intellect. I've spent most of my life studying intelligence. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I'm known for my theory of multiple intelligences, but I think I've reached the point where I realize that it doesn't matter in the long run how smart you are, or even how you are smart. If you don't have good character, if you don't try to do the right thing, it's really all going to come to naught. So anyway, that's what I have to say, telling you about a project we're excited about, working on it as much as we can, trying to understand good work, first close to home, and then we hope elsewhere as well. I hope that you found this of some interest, and now I'm going to turn it back to, I guess I don't know whether the moderator is Derek or not. I didn't hear, but I'm going to turn back whoever the moderator is.
Yes, Dr. Gardner, I'm here, and I just realized I forgot to introduce myself. Not that it's very important. Name is John Galvin. I'm a psychologist. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now I'd like to invite one of our colleagues to share some reflections. And the first is Deborah Khoshaba, who is with Pepperdine University. Would you please share with us your thoughts?
Okay. Good morning, Dr. Gardner.
Keep the mic as close to your mouth as you can.
Pardon? Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's excellent.
Oh, very good. Okay. First of all, great. First of all, I want to thank you for addressing such an important topic. And as I sat there listening to you, and I did have the pleasure of getting your book and immersing myself in it, to find out more about your ideas, I found, like any good works that it stimulated a tremendous amount of ideas of my own. Okay, so bear with me because I know you know your work, but let me summarize some of your ideas in an effort to, as a segue to some of my questions for you. Okay. Okay. Okay, you talk about the 21st century demand for knowledge workers, especially in the sense that today's workers need to be very resilient, hardy, and to have a breadth of knowledge that really transcends every task level. This guarantees that they'll be able to produce things that address market pressures and help them to maintain market share. Pardon? I see this way. Can you see me now? Okay, forgive me. As well as to maintain gainful employment for everyone in the company. Okay, you address questions that are very important. Number one, how can today's workers continue to do good work despite this given that I just mentioned? And what can people do when external pressures challenge their personal ethical values that you defined as historical background traits as well as identity? Okay, I'm going to move on. You also address that when there is you have certain ideas that when there is a misalignment between society's demands to meet society's needs, with being able to maintain professional standards, competency, and as well as that match your ethical values, there becomes a misalignment in today's worker. You also make the statement that what is healthy today is when there is an alignment not only with today's worker relative to company values, but when there's alignment with the company values or the mission in relation to social values. And this leads to some of my questions. You do say that while a minimal alignment can certainly create tensions necessary for raising to one's consciousness the duality between one's values and social demands, you do not you maintain that the alignment is that which is healthy and produces flow. Okay. What I want to address is the idea of misalignment and maintaining and being able to maintain a dynamic balance with misalignment without having to resolve yourself relative to social values. If that's something that needs to also be considered, because as we look through history, we know that some of the greatest contributions that we have today from our ancestors come from people who society as well as their professions did not define as doing good work. Okay. In fact, many of these people were evaluated as social pariahs, okay, heretics, and it took death and centuries after their death to recognize the social value of their contributions. Let me also, in relation to this idea, address individuals in the context of their day where they would have been regarded to be doing good works. And only in retrospect do we see that these good works had implications for some of the problems we're dealing with today. Okay. A less dramatic example than the one I'm going to give would be Enrico Fermi. I don't think that any of us could say that Fermi didn't do good works. In fact, he was hailed for the invention of the atomic bomb. One of the problems that we're dealing with today is Enrico Fermi's ability to do good works that was certainly in alignment with the social values of the day and in alignment with his profession. Okay, let me go on to something more dramatic. Hitler. Okay. Hitler was in alignment with himself, and I certainly would imagine, which horrifies us, that Hitler had flow. He woke up in the morning and felt good about what he was doing. Okay, because he believed in what he really truly believed. Okay, in what he needed to do. Okay, he also had alignment in terms of society. And of course that was easy to do because it was more authoritarian based. Okay, let me go on. So that raises the issue for me of good works. And I found as I read your book and thought, oh, how timely and what an interesting topic, I found in my own estimation that it was addressing what the existentialists refer to as issues related to the public and the physical world, the Umwelt, the phenomenological world of our experience. While this is extremely important, I wonder if good works needs to address a level of personal development that refers to transcendent values. You address in your book on multiple intelligences, which I also found very enjoyable, the numerous intelligences and how these need to be given weight and addressed. One of the intelligences that you said that you were interested in, but you had not explored fully, was spiritual intelligence. So I want to link spiritual intelligence with people who could tolerate misalignment in an effort to do good works that neither fit their profession or social values of the day. Okay. So I guess I'm opening that up to you, Dr. Gardner, as to, are you considering an aspect of good works that involves ethics that transcends the social world?
Okay, can I comment now?
Please.
Yes, okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for a very good set of comments. It's been frustrating in writing this book that it hasn't gotten much reaction. That's the part that came out, actually published in September of 2001, another mine. So I'm a bit starved for good commentary, very, very appreciative. Let me begin with just a clarification. Nobody, including Csikszentmihalyi, believes that the state of flow has anything to do with ethics or morality. Flow is simply, as you implied, so much being involved in your work or your play that you lose track of time and space. And so a safecracker or a mountain climber or a surgeon or a demagogue who is really in the realm deeply in flow, in fact, flow can often be quite antisocial. I mean, gangs, teenagers engage in things that produce flow, and we have to live with the consequences. So there's no tricky because there's no connection to flow and goodness. Yet we do argue that if there's too little alignment in you, it's too hard to get your work done at all. So since it's easier, it was easier for Fermi to work because everybody wanted him to make the discoveries in physics that did. But I wanted to choose your nuclear weapons, and who were concerned about their possible use or misuse. Well, and those people who work with nuclear weapons without thinking it was anything of their business how it was. And then we have to go on a person-by-person basis. If I'm mistaken, Fermi died before the winter. I think he died in 1943. So since it was moved, nuclear reactions more than weapons. There were people like Gardner. The Manhattan Project were enormous quantities. And there were other people who either were very enthusiastic, which had the right, or simply said, Harry Truman said, Harry Truman said about time, why is he so upset? I'm the one who makes the decision. Many scientists have been happy with the decision of others. So we can't make a decision about an individual scholar or researcher or scientist, whether they're a good worker or a bad worker, independent of their concern with implications. In this case, Edward Teller is very important. Edward Teller is the last of these guys who's still alive. For many people, he's the bad guy. He's not only gung-ho, right, but also was the person who got Oppenheimer losing the security clearance. I would say that Teller has a reasonable argument as a good worker because he worked a great deal about the implications of his work. He just drew different conclusions. And nonetheless, I think we'd all agree he's much less impressive than Andrei Sakharov. Andrei Sakharov created a kind of impression, but then changed his whole life to the Soviet Union because of his deep concern about the world with weapons. Teller has the hope that all these things that he created are not going to explode. He's very naive. Yeah. Now, you raised the bar by bringing up Hitler. I'm sure Hitler had a lot of flow. We're not talking about flow. We're talking about the work. Actually, perhaps I don't remember. Hitler's mention was a man named Henry who was actually in charge of final solution. Hitler said about 1943, we're doing the greatest thing in the history of the world, and we're getting rid of all the undesirables, saving the very place. But what we're doing can never be known to anyone. We do operate in secrecy, whether your name is Hitler, Himmler, or Osama bin Laden. By definition, you failed the mirror test. You can't really look at what you're doing openly. You can't let other people look at this. Now, am I saying that everything in the world can be done openly? Probably not. Probably not some things that have to be done secretly. You have to pay very high prices. If you want to say you're a good worker and you've made the Hogan spy or something like that, then you get difficult to be a good worker. That's one reason why I raised the issue of business. This is I'm too more remarks because I don't want to let us comment. And you talk about knowledge workers, what's needed in the world of knowledge. Talk about that in the book. I would venture to say that what I wrote, my colleagues wrote in 1999, it all changed quite a bit. The Silicon Valley knowledge worker is not anything that anybody admires anymore. So our notion of knowledge workers can be quite different. Many people were very disappointed this week to read about Johnson & Johnson having gotten in trouble with its accounting because most people looked at Johnson & Johnson as a company which is very different from the Silicon Valley company. And I know the statistics on that. In the year 2000, the number 7 company in America in terms of business was Enron. Johnson & Johnson was 114th. In the year 2001, it was number 1. It's very sad that the company was number 1 in terms of its productivity has now been shown to be paying with its books as well. The other issue having to do with transcendent values, and with social pariahs, I'm going to just make one comment about that because I don't think I'm really able to discuss that with the seriousness that it entails. It's easiest to judge good work when you have a profession that's quite well defined, that has a set of values which are widely held and shared. Because a profession is an agreement between a group of individuals and the laity. A group of individuals are given a certain amount of autonomy and status by the laity in turn for serving the wider good, not being totally selfish. When you begin to talk about transcendent values or about social pariahs, the people who create new religions or new movements, you don't have that professional matrix against which to judge them. You really do need to have the passage of time. And that's why most remarkable people, Christ and the Buddhas and so on, you can't judge at their time. It takes centuries to really figure out whether they're big troublemakers or benevolent or some mixture of both.
Yes, and I'll just wrap this. Thank you. Oh yes, thank you. I'll just wrap this up by commenting that certainly, great religious icons and figures such as Buddha and Allah and Christ and so forth, were developing an idea that was outside of a profession. But someone like Kierkegaard and many others like Kierkegaard were not. They were judged by their peers. And so, although, and I do agree with you that it extends the topic to think about figures like this, who actually had to deal with an unbelievable amount of misalignment to do good works on the level that is passed throughout history, to pass down throughout history, and not just good works that maybe are only relevant to the day in which the person lives. So thank you so much. Okay.
I'd like to now invite Zander Ponzo of the University of Vermont to make a few comments.
Good afternoon. Hi. I didn't have the privilege of reading your book, but I did browse it, and mostly what I did was think about the key terms work and ethics and see where my mind went with that. So I'd like to share that with you, and it seems that my thoughts mostly relate to your 4 M's. So I'm hoping maybe in your next talk you'll have your first Z, okay? The other day I was in the Vancouver Public Library, and I was in their gift store, and one of the things that caught my eye was one of the refrigerator magnets. I don't know how you quote that in a scholarly work, but it struck my mind anyway. And it said that the best things in life are not things. And it caused me to think about how many people get misdirected in their pursuits in life and go after holy grails that cause less than good work and certainly unethical things. And related to this, last night Dr. James Garbarino gave a talk called Parents Under Siege. And one of the things that struck me was a case he gave of, I believe, a 14-year-old boy who, in trying to resolve some problems, decided a solution would be to hold his class hostage with a gun. As a result of this, of course, he was incarcerated, and Dr. Garbarino relates one part of this where his parents come to visit him, and this boy is now facing the possibility of long-term incarceration. And in meeting his parents in jail and being all handcuffed, his parents told him, "We love you." And according to the story, this boy described this as the best day of his life, even though he was in jail and under these circumstances. And I think for me what that means is the best thing we can give people is a sense that they belong, and that they are loved. And I think out of this deep security, which unfortunately is also seemingly fragile, I think can come good work both in the sense of expertness and expertise. I think if you really believe in yourself and have that foundation both from what your parents luckily give you and your genetics and also the workplace, then I think you're freer to create, to try new things and to find your proper niche. And I know when you were talking about in your M's, I think it was in that, one of the things you mentioned that you respect or found in these businesses, people had the courage to start something new. And I think that takes a great deal of courage to risk that other people might not accept where you're going and what you believe. And again, I think this comes out of the security that people get from their parents, and that I think organizations can nourish. I think also, and I think this leads people to get into a state of flow in their work, which I think leads to high-level work and creativity. With that, in terms of the ethical aspects of it, I think unfortunately other people go down tracks with their work where they disregard not only ethics pertaining to the consequences of what they produce, but also ethics in terms of how they deal with coworkers and their families, and how they find a balance in their life. Because I think they get over-imbued with the sense that being recognized and having a large vita and making a lot of money, that's really the important thing in life. And they start stepping over other values, which probably makes it hard for them to look into what you refer to as a personal mirror. And I think that, again, is less likely to happen if people's center is more, in a sense, spiritual sense of caring about themselves, number one, believing in themselves, and having respect for others around them. So that's mostly what I thought about with regard to what you're doing. And I don't have a question, but I'm hoping that through your work and the power of your name and your organization, you get more people to start thinking about the qualities in the workplace and in rearing workers that, and this goes in education too, to be thinking more about these important variables such as how to find the mission, the important mission, where you get models, and a reflective aspect. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, I'll make a brief comment there. Certainly, feeling that you belong, feeling that you're loved, feeling that you are a member of a community is it's a necessary condition to being, but it's not sufficient. Using some of the examples of Deborah, many people with Nazi Germany, a sense of secure SS group. Fundamentalism often has its appeal because we're insecure and they find it convenient. It's all accepting. There's a very interesting article in New Yorker magazine this week. It's gotten a lot of publicity by Malcolm Gladwell. It's called The War on Talent. It's a critique of McKinsey, which is the most prestigious management consultant company in the world. And Gladwell blames the economic turmoil in McKinsey, which he argues because everybody who works at McKinsey thinks that they're the smartest people in the world. They love each other and they don't think they can do anything wrong, and they try to plant people like them in all the big companies. It turns out that Jeff Skilling from Enron was a McKinsey person, and so on. I actually wrote a grumpy letter to the New Yorker saying it's not about intellect at all, it's about character. You'll recognize that quote. But What I really want to do is offer a friendly amendment to what Zander said, is that wonderful that it is to be long, that's not in itself a guarantor that you'll be doing the right thing or even thinking about the right thing. It's not my business.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the discussion with the audience, but permit me just to maybe give a little context. I've often felt that as social scientists, we are on the Titanic, measuring how rapidly the ship is sinking. And I feel here in Dr. Gardner's research a controversy of how radical will we be in response to what we're finding in our research, and how will we take our academic research to a social level. I think that's a very important topic.
Great. So very, very grateful to hear what you're doing. Much of my concern, I'm Daniel Helminiak. I'm at the University of West Georgia in the psychology department, humanistic transpersonal. I do spirituality as a psychologist. And I also would, to give you some background, I studied with Bernard Lonergan, whom you may know of. He was at Harvard for a semester or two and then taught at Boston College in his later years. But he, in my mind, he gives a solution or an answer to the question I'm going to be posing to you. The thing I'm so happy to hear is that someone is dealing with this issue of values in a way that seems not to be buying into the radical postmodernism that would say all things are equal. It's obvious from your discussion that all things are not equal, and good work is not the same as bad work. The question I'm having is, with your team, what kinds of criteria did you come up with, to the extent that you must have discussed these things, to determine what good work would be? Because you gave a number of examples, and I would certainly agree with what you were saying. What criteria did you come up with? And besides that, what basis to ground, to justify those criteria as actually being criteria of what is good? And I think that's posing the transcendent value question. And I don't mean transcendent in the sense of going to heaven or becoming theological. I take transcendent in the sense of something that promises open-ended, ongoing progress, development, hope, life. Could you address that, please? I'd certainly appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. Needless to say, we discussed these issues a great deal. You may not be satisfied with the result. I'm not satisfied either, but I'm going to try to be as honest as I can. We don't believe that we're in the position to determine who's a good worker and who's not. We simply don't know enough. Indeed, there were examples where people told us stuff and it was very convincing. And next week we'd open up the newspaper and we'd discover about these people, names that you would know, that what they told us wasn't true. And so we're not investigative reporters. The way we put it in our book, we accept what people say at face value, but we don't check our skepticism at the door. So the next week we read about somebody that they lied to us, that becomes part of our analysis. But we don't attempt to declare whether somebody is a good worker or not. The examples I gave were just my own list because I thought it would be nice to have some examples, but even in those cases I could mount critiques of each of them. Nobody is a perfect worker. We believe, however, that you can learn about good work even if there's no prototype, because you can piece together aspects of people in that profession who in one way or the other do represent what good work is. I'll use an example which people will pick up right away. I would hesitate to say that Bill Clinton is a good worker in the general sense. But I think you can learn a lot about good work and being a leader by studying Bill Clinton. And that's probably true about, I wrote a book in which Margaret Thatcher was featured. She's not one of my heroines, but I think you can learn a lot about how to be at least an effective leader by studying Margaret Thatcher. So, the first part of my answer to your question is, we don't try to play God, say who is a good worker and a bad worker. We do try to say what good work is by piecing together lessons from different individuals. That said, there are two other things to say. In some of our studies, for example, in our business study, we actually have a set of nominating criteria for business people who are good workers. And those criteria represent our own thoughts about what it means to be a good worker. So I can't remember them all, but let me tell you the kinds of things they are. You could tell me whether they would be consistent with what you or Lonergan believes. Number one, having a stated set of values. Being able to state what it is that you believe in, what it is that you don't believe in. Number two, as you yourself said, engaging regularly and reflectively in whether you are applying those values or not. Not because you're certain that you're going to be doing it, but because it is better to be engaged in that kind of perennial conversation and to bring other people in that conversation, not to assume that you yourself are so omniscient you can determine whether you're doing good work. Very, very key. Will you go with your principles even if it goes against your self-interest? I think if there's anything which is the cutting line, and I implied this in my responses about Nazi Germany, is the hypocrite test. Do you really live by the values that you advocate, even when it's not in your self-interest to do so? In my probably never to be published critique of Malcolm Gladwell in The New Yorker, I did some due diligence. I quoted the head of McKinsey, Ken Lay, and Jeff Skilling, each of whom were the two CEOs of Enron. I can't remember the quotations exactly, but let me tell you what the gist is. Jeff Skilling said at Enron, we're doing God's work. Ken Lay said, this is the most, I'm the son of a clergy, and this is the most value-rich place I've ever been at. And every day we ask, are we living up to our values of developing human potential and something else like that? And Gupta, who's the head of McKinsey, said the bottom line isn't important to McKinsey. What's important is our values as an organization. These individuals all sound like great workers. Then you see what they did, and you realize that they're hypocrites. They're preaching something that they don't do in their own life. So those are the kinds of issues we look at. You might say, well, we haven't talked about things like telling the truth, integrity. That's because everybody says that. We don't talk to anybody who doesn't say those things. So the question is, do you apply them? Do you engage in self-examination? You draw other people into those examinations, and when you go by what you believe in, even when it goes against your self-interest. That's how I would think about the issue. You couldn't agree with me more. I have essentially no use for postmodernism in this realm. I think it's mischief. It begins with an interesting insight about the mind and about scholarship, and ends up with a disastrous view of the world. And I would commend to those of you who want to read further the summer issue of the Responsive Community. This is the journal published by Amitai Etzioni, Communitarian, which has Stanley Fish's well-known argument about relativism, postmodernism, and September 11th, answered by about 20 different people, then responded to by Stanley Fish. So if you want to know how the relationship of postmodern relativism on the one hand transcended issues like, is there anything to say about 9/11 other than that Taliban and the Al-Qaeda were doing what they think was right, you should take a look at that text.
Well, my name is Alfred Lengle. I'm coming from Vienna, and I appreciate very much the attempt you made on an empirical way to investigate what is a good work. But maybe I didn't understand everything correctly. But for me, the question is arising if there have to make at least two or even more distinctions. When you are talking about what is a good work, I'm wondering, this refers, in my understanding, to the effectiveness of the work, maybe to the commitment. And in that sense, I would say Teller did a good work, and everyone, and Al-Qaeda did a good work, well committed and very effective. The distinction, the one we should make at least, I think, is to differentiate the good thing to the right. And the right refers to the way we deal with things, and how can we measure what is right or wrong? There are always, as far as I know, two levels which measure the rightness and the false. The one is the inner moral conscience, and the other is the society, the superego, as Freud was saying. And so we have two moral levels which are defining the right and the correct and the wrong and the false. And there are maybe other levels too, like the meaning or the weakness and the strength in the work. But that would go too far. But just I'm wondering what you are thinking about the distinction between good and right. Thank you.
Well, this is a thoughtful question. There may be a certain semantic issue. Obviously, your English is very good, but if you remember in the beginning of my talk, I made a clear distinction between people who were expert in something and people who were morally responsible. And in English, good is that play on words. I'm not sure in German whether, I guess gut has those two meanings in German as well. But certainly anybody who's a top flight physicist, whether it's Teller or Sakharov or Oppenheimer, gets to be good in the first sentence of the word. That's what you would call effective and committed, but they don't necessarily qualify as good in the second sense of the word, namely as somebody who we consider to be a responsible, moral, ethical person. Now, you of course rightly point out, as other people have, it's not an easy matter to say who is right or who is good in the second sense. And as you rightly say, there is both a personal and a communal aspect to that. And neither of those is definitive, because over time we can change our own minds and society can change as well. You come from Austria, which obviously has done a lot of self-examination since March of 1938 about its responsibility, suing 50 years or 60 years or 70 years. But I think here is a link to one of the themes of your conference, namely democracy. As Churchill well said, and I'm sure other people have quoted this at the conference, democracy is the second worst form of government. It's totally flawed. Unfortunately, every other form is the worst form. Democracy is open. You discuss things, argue, You have to defend yourself. You have to essentially confront alternative points of view and be open to changing. This is what's wrong with Al-Qaeda. This is what's wrong with Nazi Germany. These are totalitarian, closed societies. Anybody whose opinion is opposite is killed. They are anti-democratic in the most fundamental sense. So the issue about goodness cannot even be raised in those societies because you don't have that open criticism, that openness. In this way, I'm completely with Isaiah Berlin. You know, we have to at least have a society where people can talk freely about what happens, where people don't consciously hurt other people. We may not be able to have any values beyond that. That's an open, what he calls negative liberty kind of society. These are societies which are devoid of liberty, so they aren't even as part of the conversation, as far as I'm concerned. Now you can become a Chomskyite, and you can say, well, the United States is a closed society, but I think that's absurd. I just think it's absurd, but there are people who take that.
I'm Salvatore Matti. I'm at the University of California, and I'd like to build on what Dr. Khoshaba was saying before, to just,
Were you also a teacher of Mike Csikszentmihalyi?
Oh yeah, sure. He was my first research assistant, way, way back. And it goes like this. It seems to me that in your terms, it's misalignment between professions and fields that's the stimulus, the impetus to creativity on the part of courageous or hardy people. Then once that creativity takes place, if it's a really creative act, it's not only new, but also effective. And consequently, what it can do is stimulate a new alignment. What do you think of that?
I don't know that I have a very good answer to that question. You know, both I and Csikszentmihalyi study creativity. I think you have as well. And there are all kinds of creativity which arise from all different reasons. I mean, how do we think about Mozart or Beethoven with reference to what came before, with reference to the societies? How do we think about Einstein? Einstein was not particularly in conflict except with certain ideas. He wasn't in conflict. His colleagues, he basically ignored them. So I would certainly agree with you that often a felt misalignment is a stimulus to creativity, but that misalignment could occur inside your own head or with other people or with what Thomas Kuhn calls the previous paradigm. It could be quite self-generated. Mozart, I think, was the most creative human being in the history of the world, but he wasn't particularly in conflict with the norms or mores. He just did stuff better than anybody else. So I guess my initial reaction is what you said is too pat, and that's why I don't think I can give a good answer to it. We'd have to unpack creativity, unpack societies and their norms at different points, and the individual aspect, which you know a lot about, how people, in a sense, develop their own misalignments, even when other people don't see them, and their own misalignments may eventually change a paradigm. It doesn't come particularly from other people. Before Chomsky did his work, nobody realized there was a problem in how linguistics was done. He realized it was on. So I think you've opened up a fascinating space, but I don't think that, I think your formula is too simple. It's too diachronic, not synchronic.
My name is Shimshon Nykrug. I'm a gerontologist in a small college in Israel in the Department of Social Work. First, I want to thank you for your presentation and for what it caused me to think about my own work. The question that I have for you is, do you feel that there is a bias that results from your choice of professions and the people you chose to study? If I think about the work of the people who I'm working with, who are older people, and their work is in the professions of volunteerism and grandparenting, using your criteria of self-examination and the willingness to act not in concert with personal gain, those values are almost universal in the professions of the people that I work with. What if you looked at professions like mothering or other professions outside of the capitalist structure, which causes people to internalize certain values in order to become famous? There are a lot of people who do good work who don't become famous. Thank you.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy with the sentiment of your talk, but of your question, but in a sense, it doesn't particularly align with what we're trying to do. Let me try to unpack that. We deliberately have focused most of our work on professions for the reasons stated, because there is a clear set of norms and values, because there is a bargain between the professional and society. And that's why I made the allusion before to business, because in a sense, business probably isn't a profession, and I don't think theater is either. So they're almost contrast cases. Social work is a profession. It's often called, and as people misinterpret this, it's often called one of the minor professions. Nursing, social work, pre-collegiate education. Those should be studied. In fact, we've tried to get money to study them. Maybe proving your point, we haven't been able to be successful to study them yet. But you're quite right. In those professions, the market forces are less pronounced, and some of the individual value ones come to the fore. Motherhood is not a profession. There's no way in which we could really apply our technology to that. This doesn't mean I'm not interested in motherhood, but that's why I don't think your comment is on target when we bring up motherhood. However, I will say that we've done a lot of work in the area that you are interested in. We've looked at the Albert Schweitzer Fellows, who are individuals who are in the medical professions who get a very small degree of funding to serve their community. We've looked at what we call soup kitchen kids, who are kids who are very moved by problems in their community and who try to do something on their own to help. We've looked at social entrepreneurs. You probably know that term. These are people who are trying to bring entrepreneurship into the social realm. And there are a lot of things that I could say about those examinations. Those examinations we've done. I'll just throw out a few things to show you we are thinking about these issues. One is that most of the people who get involved in these highly caring realms are people who had a personal tragedy. I could unpack that, or who are marginal in some way. So perhaps you're right in implying they're different than people who go to law school. But even the medical people who are medical people, what makes them want to go to work in Lambarin, where Schweitzer went, it tends to be a personal kind. Again, often they're very religious, sometimes quite fundamentalist in their religion, and perhaps somewhat less reflective because they know, quote unquote, what the right thing to do is, but that can get them in trouble. The most fascinating thing is, this is a small finding, so don't go publish it, is among the young people who we've met, who are ones who want to paint on wide canvas. These are kids who, let's say, read about sweatshops in Pakistan, start a campaign so that kids there go to school and don't have to work at the age of 7 or 8. In fact, the people who we've studied tend to have single mothers. So anyway, what I'm saying without trying to be too defensive is we're interested in these issues, try to study them in our own way, but they're not part of the Good Work Project. Only works in looking at professions. It doesn't work when you begin to talk about things like motherhood. People are just quote unquote good people. You need to have a different set of lenses to look at that.
My name is Sylvie. I'm a host volunteer in this conference. And I was wondering...
Can you hold the microphone closer?
Okay, my name is Sylvie, and I'm a host volunteer in this conference. And my question to you is it possible, like you talk about good work and good ethic and everything, is it possible in the structure of the society? Like, I'm not advocating that we all go, I don't know, flew into the Amazon forest and develop, way of living there because there's no hope in that society. But at the same time, that's what I'm wondering. Like, is there any hope in the market value type of dictatorship type of values and everything? Is there any hope in there to have good work, good people, compassion, love, and all those stuff that you have talked about, which is marvelous? And it seems like it's possible for people like you that have a lots of power, maybe because you're a professor, you have a lot of power, it's possible for you because you have a big name, but for other people, is it possible to do that in this world and be part of this world and have integrity, basically?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be engaged in the study if I didn't think that it was possible. We all have existence proofs. People who do good work, whether they are known or not. Don't overestimate how much power I have. Don't overestimate how much power any of us has. There's a big fault line between Europe and the United States, which I think underlies perhaps some of the questions. That is, the United States is an extreme because we really believe the most that we ought to do is to give people opportunity, and then they're on their own. In Europe, there's much more of a belief that there should be what you might call a floor or a security blanket or a provision of resources and of support to people who can't make it on their own. And I think all of us on the project are much more sympathetic to that point of view than to a, might say, a hard-nosed market point of view. But markets are human inventions. Market wasn't created by God. It wasn't even created by Darwin. It wasn't created by Adam Smith. It's a human invention. And we have markets in places which are quite totalitarian, like China, Singapore, which is kind of moderately totalitarian. Places like the United States, which, sorry, Mr. Chomsky, is not totalitarian. So markets can live in all kinds of political environments. What we're trying to argue, and I think this is consistent with what you're saying, is that a world where a certain kind of market absolutism is dominant or prominent is not a world in which most of us should have to live, and most of us should want to live. When people fund our project, and we need money to fund it, and they ask me, what do you hope will come out of the project? I give them an answer which they don't like, but it's actually an honest answer. I say, I would like people all the time to be talking about good work. And when you read about somebody or you hear about somebody, you say, are they a good worker? That becomes one of the ways in which you evaluate it, is whether they're trying to do good work, whether or not they always succeed. So, will this effort and other ones be successful? Nobody knows. But the alternative is not to try. And I wouldn't be devoting my time to this and talking with you about this if I didn't think it was worthwhile. And I think your question implies that it's worthwhile. And maybe one of the good things about this economic meltdown that's taking place in Japan and Hong Kong and Argentina and Brazil, maybe in the Amazon forest and the United States, and to some extent in Europe, maybe it's going to make people re-examine the notion that the person who has the most money at the end is the one who wins. I hope so.
Dr. Gardner, our time is up. We'd like to thank you for engaging us in this very important dialogue. There are many more questions that people would like to ask and responses to your work, but we have other items on the program, and I'm sure you are ready for lunch. Thank you very much. We wish you the very best in your work and look forward to continuing this dialogue in other ways. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
One last question, Dr. Gardner. Some people want to know how they might contact you. Can you share your email address if you're comfortable doing so?
Yeah, Howard at PZ, stands for Project Zero, pz.harvard.edu. And if you lose it, I'm easily trackable down at Harvard, even though I don't have as much power as the questioner thought.
Thank you.